Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and a lot of you guys have been asking me which classes are going to be the best for patch 8.3. Now, I'm always here to offer you guys advices on any classes. Honestly, I believe all of you guys should play the playstyle that you enjoy, the spec that you like, the class fantasy you would rather be playing, instead of always trying to gun for the very best, the next level, anything that's going to give you a competitive advantage. I mean, honestly, would you rather play a spec that's super good but it's not enjoyable, or you would rather to play a spec that's actually fun to play but might not be at the top of the DPS meters? But this video, let's go the other direction. Let's tell you about some of the lesser played specs, some of the underdogs of the game, the off metas, the specs you have to put in more time than your average Joe in order to be good at, but that might have that rewarding feeling of figuring out and playing something that not everybody can pick up upon. The whole point of this is to maybe give you guys a challenge. Maybe some of you want something more out of Battle for Azeroth, and with the final patch and with the ability for a lot of us to get a whole new fresh start on a brand new character, maybe some of you guys might want to dwell into playstyles that you might actually enjoy, you just didn't know about it because everybody else told you that these specs are bad. So let's explore some of the lesser played, some of the harder to pick up, harder to get into, and harder to maintain specs that are available in Battle for Azeroth. We are going to start off easy for you guys. We're not going to start on the hardest possible available. We'll save that closer to the end of the video. Let's start off with some of the specs that are not as popular, but are not quite the most difficult ones to get up and running. The first one is going to be the Arcane Mage. It's official, I'm going to be playing my mage as Arcane for the next patch of 8.3. I was thinking maybe Frost, massive glacial spikes, but no. I discovered that Arcane has a very fun build with massive damage numbers, but it definitely does take a little bit of work to get to there. Arcane Mage is one of those specs that's very weird because it is a spec that's consistently buffed every single patch, but it still somehow ends up being towards the bottom of the DPS charts. Arcane Mage is super weird because it's a spec that basically has 4 or 5 buttons at max to play with when it comes to your base rotation, but even with a simple rotation it still kind of struggles to be any good. Of course, with gear and with preparation, with the right traits and right essences, Arcane Mage can blow everybody out of the water, but Arcane Mage isn't born with those skills off the get-go. I would say that Arcane Mage is one of the easier classes on this list to gear, because I was mostly gearing for fire. Trying to get enough haste and versatility in my gear and trying to go for the highest item level for the most part, and then as soon as I swapped to Arcane from fire, traded out a couple of my traits, traded out a couple of my essences, grinded out all that Azerite gear needed to play Arcane, it really started to come together. Still, the spec is one of the lesser known specs, lesser played specs, and it could have potential to be really powerful in patch 8.3. But as of right now, Arcane definitely has one of the lesser, smaller communities than something like a Frost Mage community or the Fire Mage community. The next spec on this list is going to be an easy one, and that's going to be Marksman Hunter. It's very similar to Arcane Mage in terms of why the popularity of Marksman is nearly not as big right now. It's the same thing that happens to all the other classes that have all the 3 specs as DPS. Usually you have 1 or 2 specs that are the strongest, but the third one gets left behind, either because the mechanics favor the stronger specs, or maybe the developers just didn't give enough tuning and fine work and love to the one spec that's usually trailing behind the others. Marksman Hunter saw a lot of love in the heyday, but right now I would say most people simply swap to Beast Mastery because we can get astronomical amounts of critical strike on our gear, which makes Beast Mastery Hunters with a specific playstyle insanely busted. Marksman, however, can do well compared to Beast Mastery, it just does require a lot of gear. But even then I would say Marksman is still a decent spec, at least better than some of the other specs we have on this list. It definitely does not take nearly as much effort on Marksman as the other specs in order to be actually quite viable. The next few specs on this list are a little bit hard to get into. Most of these specs deal with gear being a very high requirement, whether you need the best in slot Azerite essences, perfect amount of stats, specific trinkets, but these specs are starting to get a lot more specific. We have the Arms Warrior, which is a brother spec to the Fury Warrior, but unlike Fury, Arms is just not consistent. The one thing that a lot of people will give Arms Warriors is its cleave capability. Arms Warriors can really bust out quite a bit of AoE damage. 2 target cleave, 3 target cleave, get a bunch of enemies together and allow Arms Warriors to go ham. Yeah, Arms Warriors can really put out some damage. Where Arms Warriors struggles is single target, consistency on AoE or single target, and anything that isn't PvP. Hell, Arms Warriors are good in PvP because of the natural Mortal Strike effect, and the Mastery adds for the consistent damage which it needs. But in dungeons and raids and every other bit of content, sometimes Arms Warriors simply just doesn't have any rage to even press your buttons to do damage, which can make the spec feel a little bit clunky, which is why it requires an incredible amount of haste and very specific traits in order to be actually worth considering. But if you're someone who is willing to put in the time for Arms Warriors, it definitely has an awesome payoff. It has a unique playstyle. I like the uniqueness that it has in terms of the 2-target cleave. The execute mechanic feels very satisfying to play with. Bladestorm feels very impactful as an AoE ability, and is definitely an acquired taste. Frost Death Knights are in a very similar position. They can do quite a bit of AoE damage as soon as you can get the big frosty breath rolling. Frost Death Knights, though, just like Arms, are very gear dependent. It's a little bit difficult to describe where Arms and where Frost is in terms of gear. I would say that Arms is closer to getting the right traits and the right trinkets and the right essences, while for Frost it's really just outfitting yourselves with the best gear possible, since their own class traits are not super good. I hope I'm not scaring you. Frost Death Knights can definitely shine. And I would say that gearing up a Frost DK is noticeable, you can see the progress, and most importantly, it's very rewarding to finally be able to put out some damage once you have the right pieces of gear. It's a very unique playstyle that really loves when enemies are stacked all together. It really hates when enemies are far apart, and it also hates mechanics that make you move around a lot. But if you can get everybody to group up, then Frost DK can definitely unleash some incredible bursts in front of their targets. Demonology Warlock is another one of those classes that's great at AoE, especially when enemies stack up. But what's holding it back is the fact that you need gear in order to make Demonology work. Hell, Demonology was actually the coolest playstyle at the beginning of BFA. The idea of summoning a billion pets and empowering them with your tyrant was a novel idea, but it fell short fairly quickly. Where Demonology saw itself become popular is during the battle for Dalaran, where everybody would use their imps to sacrifice to make a massive tyrant happen. Since then, gear became the go-to for Demonology to make the most powerful tyrant ever, sacrifice as many imps, and use the traits in order to beef up a meaty tyrant. Demonology on its own isn't bad. The only thing that can be bad about it are the fact that you have so many pets to control. And a lot of these pets sometimes do very dumb things. For example, Tyrant, you have zero control over him. Imps, sometimes they hit the wrong target. Demon Dogs can randomly swap to an enemy, so the actual pets themselves can be detrimental when they hit the wrong target. However, when it works right, it works right. The problem is the current meta, at least the Eternal Palace raid. It just benefits Affliction Warlocks with a massive burst playstyle, or downing up multiple enemies across distances, or playing Destruction Warlock, checking out a bunch of Chaos Bolts and being very gear independent. With Demonology being the spec you have to put more time into, and the fight's not really favoring you, there's a reason why not as many people are checking out Demonology. However, the new raid could be a perfect opportunity for the spec to come back and shine. Now, the next few specs on this list are going to be a little bit harder to get into. They're going to be the specs that basically need almost full best in slot gear in order to be good. These specs are also a lot less forgiving when it comes to you messing up your rotation. But if you're able to master the rotation with the right gear, these specs can still shine, single target or AoE. We're going to start with the Feral Druid, and out of all the alts that I play, out of all the specs I checked out, Feral has definitely been one of those specs that I can easily tell you has been very gear dependent. The gear you need for the spec, the essences you need are going to be of utmost importance. But the one thing that is super important about Feral is your playstyle. Your rotation, I would say for the spec, has to be near perfect. There have been moments where I had a really good streak. I'm using the right abilities, I'm having a really good uptime on my bleeds, I'm getting really good crits, but as soon as I mess up one ability, I use one ability wrong, I forget to use a buff at the right time, I forget to empower one of my bleeds, that's it, my damage is in free fall. As soon as I'm able to catch myself, I can never really truly climb back up. This would be one of the first few specs that I would say is actually difficult to play, as you need full mastery in order to have competitive damage numbers. I mean, my character right now as is Feral, since it was one of my newer characters before the patch 8.3, it was really difficult for me to get the right gear. I didn't really get through nearly as many Mythic Plus weeks in order to get my best in slot pieces. I didn't get to do nearly as much content to get my best in slot essences. But already with the way the spec is set up, I'm already doing decent damage as long as my rotation is spot on. Of course, gear is gonna allow you to be a little bit easier to pick up and play, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see how the spec will work out in patch 8.3. Another spec that's very gear dependent and needs almost perfect rotation is Enhancement Shaman. Enhance has been a very enjoyable experience, however. I've enjoyed Enhance so much, I've actually almost have gotten Blood of the Enemy. I've been grinding BGs, epic BGs, and even though it's the squishiest class I've ever played for PvP and have very little experience in it, it's actually quite enjoyable. I would say Enhancement Shaman rotation, when you get it right, is actually very fun. Especially if you go for the PvP rotation, where there's not a single miss global and there's always an ability to press. But even the current playstyle for Enhancement is more about monitoring your resources and making sure you don't overcap rather than always having a button to press. Still, very enjoyable spec overall, but definitely did need to do a bit of gear grinding before it allows me to do any decent damage. But still, no matter how much gear you have on your enhancement, one thing I noticed is it still is very unforgiving if you mess up your rotation. But it's awesome because if you're able to get your abilities right, you're able to get a couple Lucky Storm Strike procs, you're able to get quite a bit of damage, and it feels good to see your character perform well if you are able to play the class properly. However, it also sucks whenever you mess up one ability or another. Maybe you refresh a buff when you didn't need to, and now you're kind of at the bottom of the damage charts. However, your experiences may vary depending on how geared you are. Again, this is my alt character, not completely perfectly slotted in until I get that Blood of the Enemy. Then we have Survival Hunter, another spec that I've been gearing quite a lot before patch 8.3, and it's super enjoyable as soon as I was able to complete the gear setup. Now, this character is probably some of the more geared characters, except for one trait that I was missing, and this spec is really going to punish you without having the proper traits. But the playstyle is actually quite good, and it's actually quite simple. Gear is going to allow you survival hunters to have an easier playstyle, and it'll allow you to do more damage with the easier playstyle. Prior to that, you have to go through a very convoluted playstyle of managing a bunch of different buffs while managing a bunch of different dots, while managing your resources, while managing stacks of mongozabites, and it's just messy. So as soon as you're able to reach a whole peak of best in slot gear, you're able to just throw that complicated rotation out of the window and really just start slamming the enemy. There are multiple different playstyles for survival as well, and some of these playstyles are better than others, so there's more than one way to approach this spec, but definitely gear is going to be your biggest hurdle when it comes to playing survival. Although I feel like in dungeons and raids, the payoff is definitely worth it. The playstyle for the spec is just way too unique to pass up. And finally, I would have to say this would be the hardest spec in the game to pick up for dungeons and raids right now, would be the Subtlety Rogue. At the beginning of BFA, Subtlety Rogues were actually pretty good, but ever since Blizzard gutted a main mechanic for them where they could do more single target damage from AoE, this is where the spec was kind of in freefall. But it looks like the spec is starting to pick back up. If you have a sub-rogue that is geared to the teeth right now, you're still gonna do kind of questionable damage. However, you can do quite decent damage with the proper, near perfectly statted, near perfectly geared setup. You can run keys and you can do raids and you can do decent damage, but no matter what you do, for the most part, expect yourself not to be at the top of the charts unless the rest of your team is doing something incredibly wrong. But the spec is very enjoyable to play once you get it. Definitely a complicated rotation when it comes to first picking it up. There's a couple different things for you to juggle, and gear is going to help alleviate the rotation playstyle, but the pains never truly ever go away. I would say Subtlety Rogue would be the best spec for anybody who's a true masochist and you want to master a spec that barely anybody plays, but you might be able to put out decent damage here and there. Now, Subtlety might be one of the specs that could see the best of its shine in patch 8.3. Sub-rogues in previous expansions has always been a spec that scaled the best with endgame gear. So there might be opportunity for sub-rogues to make a resurgence for Mythic Plus dungeons or even main game raiding. Of course, subtleties are pretty monstrous when it comes to PvP. They still are a little wonky, a little bit weird, but thank God Blizzard unnerfed some of the PvP nerfs a while ago, so at least they have something what they're good at. and I expect for them to be even better for PvP in patch 8.3. Anyway guys, that's going to be my list of some of the lesser main spec, lesser meta specs available for patch 8.2.5 and are expected to be more or less in the same place in patch 8.3 unless something drastic happens. I hope you guys enjoyed this type of video to get to know which specs are the least played. These are the specs that I actually like to commit most of my time into. I've always enjoyed playing this weird playstyles that I personally liked. Usually anything that is kind of off meta, anything that's not super popular, I usually like to give it a go in order to see if that's something I enjoy. And majority of the specs I either play right now or I used to commit a decent amount of time in the past. You know, as much time as one man can commit to all these different alts that I play. But I would have to say that all these specs can potentially be viable if you're someone who is willing to invest the time, and if you're someone who likes a challenge out of World of Warcraft, maybe even playing a Demon Hunter all your time and you feel like it's just way too easy and you want a more challenging spec, you could try one of these and give them a go. I would say that all these specs have a viability to play in the end game of WoW. Hell, all these specs have seen some action in the last fight of Eternal Palace, Azara on Mythic. So if those guys can do it on Mythic, so can you. And I think it might be something worth challenging yourself in case you want to play one of these playstyles. Hell, a lot of these playstyles are quite unique and they have their own quirks, and it might be the quirk that you might enjoy, even though the spec doesn't need to be at the top of the end game level. If you like playing it, that's all the value that one needs. Thank you guys all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see all of you guys in another video.